Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is, of course, is the third day. We've saved the very best for the NAADSN Student Conference on expressions of new ideas and explorations of these very critical issues. My name is Rob Hubert. I'm at the University of Calgary, and I can't ever remember what title Whitney gave me within NAADSN, but I've got some title within NAADSN. So I am indeed proud to be a participant from the very beginning of this very, very important network. One of which is, of course, the most important issues is the manner in which it has been able to encourage and facilitate the works of emerging new scholars into this very important field of Arctic security. As I said, I'm not joking. We've had an excellent series of speakers, but we've saved two of the very best for the very end to ensure that once again we can explore some very, very important ideas. The two speakers, you can of course read in detail their CVs. For young scholars, they already have very impressive CVs behind them. Kate, of course, is a master's student over at the University of Toronto, and Adam is finishing off his PhD over at Dalhousie University, both of which are representative also of the Renaissance approach that many such outstanding scholars are now taking. Both of them have either served with the Canadian Navy or are either reserve officers with the Canadian Navy, and once again illustrating this ability to move effortlessly between scholar, sailor, and intellectual. And so we are indeed very lucky to have these two coming to speak before us in terms of the issues that they are presenting. Because we only have two speakers, each will be given up to 20 minutes to be able to address. I believe both of them will be having presentations, so hopefully we will be able to get that running. We will be beginning with Adam, and then we will be following with Kate. So Adam, if you would please begin our discussion. Oh, and I should add, after both Adam and Kate have had their 20 minutes each, we will then open up for discussion. And since this is the last panel, we can basically discuss it for as long as we want to. And so I look very much forward to hear two very, very important emerging scholars on this issue. And I look forward to engaging after. Adam, if you would please lead off.
Great, thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for being here, and Nicole for organizing the conference and inviting me. So I'm going to share my screen here for a presentation. So just give me 1 second here. So just give me 1 second. I'm going to pop this up, and can everybody see the presentation okay?
It's good.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're just going to jump right into it. And again, just thanks for NAADSN and for everyone for coming on a Friday afternoon or morning panel, wherever you are in the country. So to begin with, over the last about 10 years, we've been seeing this kind of high-level governmental institutional guidance for the Royal Canadian Navy, or the RCN, to ensure that it is both a blue water Navy and one that is Arctic capable. So when we talk about what is a blue water Navy, generally we're referring to the ability to traverse across oceans and project power to operate in other regions, specifically in the Canadian case, the maritime and littoral zones around the Eurasian supercontinent, usually as part of multinational operations. And then Arctic capable, a little bit less well defined, but for this purpose of this project, refers to the ability to operate around and through the Canadian Arctic, which is principally defined by the Arctic archipelago, consisting of thousands of islands and ice-infested waters, usually in conjunction with other federal agencies, and increasingly a select group of foreign partners, specifically continental ones in the US and Denmark. And so the blue water requirement for the RCN has always been a principal raison d'etre and foundational pillar for the organization, while the Arctic capable requirement has really only solidified over the past 2 decades into what I would call a top durable priority. And so the question becomes, how is the RCN going to meet this dual requirement that I frame it as? And Part of it is that we can see examples through how they're going to address this via the ongoing recapitalization projects of the Royal Canadian Navy. On the one hand, we see developments for the Canadian Surface Combatant, and the Joint Support Ship, which are going to kind of form this nebulous core of reconstituting Canada's blue water capability via what are called Naval Task Groups, or NTGs. And then on the other hand, we see the Harry DeWolf class Arctic and Offshore Patrol Vessels, or AOPVs, as this principal and primary Arctic capable asset. And so in this presentation, I'm going to look at 3 options for how the organization could go about meeting this dual requirement. This is kind of a bit of more of a 60,000 foot view, although I'm happy to discuss a little bit more kind of granular details. And when we're looking at these 3 options, which I've termed convergence, separation, and multitasking, it's not just about kind of the ships and the assets, although that's vitally important, but also the disposition of the organization, its operational priorities, training, activities, timelines, and also mentality. And so I really believe, I'm sure along with Rob and Kate, that we're at a critical moment for the RCN and the nature of Canadian sea power moving forward, and determining what the trajectory of the organization is going to be as we move further into the 21st century. So to begin with, I think it's really important to talk about some durable realities and durable uncertainties, because these factors are important to keep in mind when we're trying to figure out what is the best quote unquote approach to take, because this question is not simply a military technical question, which is under the purview of those in uniform. More importantly, it's a political question about what capabilities and missions will be assigned by the government to the RCN, and how those in uniform can best use what is given to them to achieve the missions that they've been assigned. And I've grouped these into 3 kind of categories to think about these influences. The first one is to deal with force, and this is broken down into first size. Given the RCN's history, Canada's largely benign home environment, organizational difficulties associated with expansion, and persistent quote unquote made in Canada options for procurement, this I think is going to constrain the size of the RCN to being a kind of a small, medium-sized force of about 24 to 30 warships divided into a handful of different types of naval platforms. It's very unlikely that we're going to see major expansion either on overall numbers or platform types unless drastic and existential changes occur in the strategic situation facing Canada, and I would say almost directly facing Canada. The second issue is about procurement, and the point I really want to mention here are twofold. One is we are seeing bipartisan support for the continuation of the national shipbuilding strategy, even with the cost augmentations. But we're also entering an era of recapitalization of the other services, the Army, the Air Force, and Special Forces as well, which is going to lead to difficulties in securing additional defense dollars, I think, moving forward, on top of just the difficulties of increasing the defense budget in Canada in general. The second point about procurement is we need to understand that there are long lead times, usually upwards of 20 years, if not longer. And therefore, a project can pass through many different security situations in the life cycle of it, including the diminution or even elimination of the original purposes of what it was to be built for. And a good example here is the Halifax class frigates, conceived of in the 1970s during the Cold War, planned in the 1980s to be these anti-submarine warfare platforms in the North Atlantic. But by the time they came into service in the 1990s, obviously the Cold War had ended, and the risk of the Soviet Union and ASW priorities had decreased significantly. So that is one factor to keep in mind there. The second kind of collection of factors are what I would call this kind of changing strategic environment. Specifically, we're all very well aware that we've entered this kind of era of strategic rivalry, where we're seeing greater Western alignment with emphasis on integration, interoperability, and metric-centric warfare against military peer competitors, specifically China and Russia. Here, we've seen the United States take the lead usually in trying to generate uniformity with allies across security, diplomatic, economic, and technological domains. For the RCN, this is leading to an increasing focus and a manifestation of its operating priorities along what I call a strategic triangle of Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Arctic, which are kind of conceptually seen as kind of quote unquote the front lines of this new kind of strategic rivalry unfolding. But it's still unclear what the distribution of focus and capabilities for the organization is going to be between them. And then the third factor is the United States itself, which is obviously our principal ally and most important international partner, as well as being obviously the continued hegemonic leader of the West. But all of those things are kind of increasingly becoming uncertain given the domestic political situation in the United States, and growing kind of a return, I would say, to more kind of consternation by a number of American officials about Canadian defense spending and efforts being kind of conceived of as laggard and not contributing enough. And so those are kind of the three factors in that cycle, or in that basket of goods. And then finally is this idea of Arctic capable. Well, I gave a definition. There's still lots of uncertainties as exactly what does this mean specifically for the Navy. So first is we have to think about the Arctic maritime environment, specifically in the North American context, about what do we expect the physical ecological changes to look like, again, over short, medium, and long term, and then the resultant changes in human activities, economic, social, political, and geopolitical. And then for the organization, the RCN itself, what does this mean for its operational reach in terms of in, through, and under the ice in particular? What about presence? Are we looking for seasonal periodic deployments or more continuous permanent ones? Third is the capabilities that are going to be brought to bear or expected to be brought to bear. Is this going to be more about constabulary and assistance to other government departments? Or are we going to increasingly see a movement towards doing other type of operations and capabilities, largely associated with war fighting and deterrence? And finally, the versatility, which is whether and how interchangeable it is expected that the RCN assets, current and future ones, are expected to be in operating in the Arctic and non-Arctic environments. And a further additional issue is how do we see the RCN playing the role in connecting into this emerging defense security ecosystem, and specifically network in the North American context, in terms of both Canada's security, but also continental security. And so let's keep all those kind of factors involved and in mind while we kind of go through these options. So the first one I talk about is convergence. And again, very kind of broad-based kind of description here, but the convergence option is there would be a long-term orientation towards building a fleet which all of its assets can, as much as practicable, operate in both Arctic and non-Arctic environments. And so the big push here would be towards kind of a mono fleet with minimum design requirements to operate in the Arctic for all platforms. The ideal bridging platform, as I kind of termed it, would be obviously nuclear-powered submarines, given their proven Arctic and blue water capabilities. However, as we all know, there's a lot of difficulties with bringing that kind of issue to bear, and it probably is not a consideration for the ongoing submarine replacement analyses that are being done right now. Another factor would be this emphasis about developing permanent stationing of RCN assets in the Arctic over time, but this would not be equivalent to the posture in the southern latitudes, but one that would increasingly grow over time. And so here, kind of the major assumption of this option would be that there are favorable technological and ecological conditions that make kind of a convergence of key characteristics of platforms more likely. And the orientation priority amongst these dual requirements is about the Arctic. The Arctic must be top of mind for all of these platforms and operations. Here, the pros of this would be there would be greater ability to do simultaneous deployments in between these maritime environments, producing uniformity of capabilities across them, and greater flexibility to government in determining how to deploy them. A mono fleet would really help in making easier on training, maintenance, and crewing, rather than having to have multiple classes and types of warships. And finally, it would be useful, even if the Arctic priority falls away, which it has before for the RCN, by having capabilities and assets that can be deployed and do things elsewhere. The cons, though, is this even really feasible, even given favorable ecological and technological developments for the Arctic? And two, attempts to create kind of all-in-one platforms could lead to the worst of both worlds, where we have assets that are neither suited for the Arctic or blue water operations. And I think here a big risk is about what type of submarine we're going to procure next, if we do procure a submarine, and whether or not we want it to perform operations under the Arctic ice. The second option is separation. Here, this option entails a formal division of the RCN assets into kind of two functional differentiated fleets. One would be an expeditionary fleet, comprised largely of warfighting platforms, capable of doing blue water type of missions, which would be focused on deployments overseas, operating in domestic or allied naval task groups. The other fleet would be a continental one comprised of coastal and Arctic capable assets, which would be more focused on conducting constabulary type of missions in continental and domestic waters, usually a single ship or small group operations in conjunction with OGDs and continental partners. Here, the pros would be that it would ensure assets are available to meet both the blue water and Arctic capable requirements as joint, simultaneous, and sustained priorities, and would evolve the risk of all-in-one builds or use of assets in very ill-suited ways. Second, it would enable specialization and expertise of crews and command teams facilitated by structured career streams within each fleet. And third, based on the second point, we could develop a cadre of experienced personnel in each fleet, specifically Arctic capable one, which would assist in informing more refined material and organizational requirements moving forward. Here, the cons are twofold. One is it seems unrealistic given the small size of the RCN and the history of using all vessels to cover off for one another. And here, the Kingston class coastal defense vessels are a very good example over the past decade or so of this. It's also very unlikely that the fleets would be self-sustaining. That is, given the fact that the RCN usually only gets the very bare minimum number of ships deemed necessary to meet its missions, with no other kind of give for other concerns and externalities. And most kind of worrying is that the fleet actually is going to shrink unless there is a replacement for the Kingston class, given that there are 12 of those and only 6 of the Harry DeWolf Arctic and offshore patrol vessels. So without a replacement for the MCDVs, we actually are going to see the total size of the force shrink. It's also unrealistic to think that the RCN would be able to develop this kind of multiple classes of the same warship. You would have, for example, an Arctic capable submarine and then kind of a more non-Arctic, more traditional blue water submarine. That just doesn't seem very feasible. And then the second major issue is that there would be a lack of options. This doesn't take into consideration what happens if there's a requirement to surge when demand augments, and the government wants options regardless of whether these options are appropriate or not for the task at hand. So here again, the major assumption of this approach is that the RCN would have the capacity to have both fleets be largely self-sustaining, and therefore the operational priority would be both. And then finally, the third approach is multitasking. Here, this really emphasizes that all RCN assets will have to be prepared to be used and work with one another interchangeably to meet this dual requirement, regardless of their suitability, purpose, or capabilities. The RCN is simply too small and will remain too small to be divided into specialized fleets, and it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to procure these kind of all-in-one assets which can operate seamlessly in both types of environments. Furthermore, given the regular practice of already doing this given what I said about the Kingston class earlier, this is basically the de facto strategy of the RCN right now. We're seeing and we'll continue to see Arctic and offshore patrol vessels on not just Arctic operations, but also non-Arctic ones, including down in the Caribbean. And we should be seeing, according to this option, more regular deployments of blue water assets to the Arctic as much as practicable to continue to regularly train and operate in these environments moving forward. The big emphasis here would be that the Navy should not punt the Arctic requirements simply to the AOPVs as this kind of appendage that operates separately from the rest of the fleet. And furthermore, we would see continued infrastructure development to support the growth of the RCN operations in the Arctic and its footprint. But again, the realization that the vast majority of the fleet will be stationed and focused on Canada's southern waters. Here, the major assumption of this approach is that the Arctic would not become the priority, the number one top shelf. We must be active and involved in here in a very sustained and large way. And then the orientation priority, therefore, is a blue water over Arctic capable one. Here, the pros is that this option allows the maximization of the flexibility of having a small fleet facing numerous and simultaneous demands by being able to deploy, fill gaps, and cover off when needed. And second, it would be able to build up this kind of culture of flexibility amongst sailors, crews, and command teams, which helps thinking about changes, modifications, and contingencies and how best to use the ships and equipment in different physical and security environments. And third, it would help ensure either a full or a further ability to have a spectrum of capabilities, a full spectrum of capabilities deployed to all theaters. The cons of this approach is, again, damage that could be incurred by the improper use of assets, which are ill-suited to be used in certain environments. The mixing and matching in this way may cause consternation amongst allies and others that Canada isn't serious about investing in needed specialized capabilities and thinking about how to make a meaningful contribution rather than just kind of quote unquote showing up. And third, we have to be mindful of the limits of flexibility and how flexible a fleet can be. And we want to be careful about not simply trying to MacGyver everything, including building additional capabilities after the fact on platforms so that they can do other missions. And here, going back to the subs, I think this is a big concern about what type of submarine we would develop and whether and how we would deploy that into the Arctic and how we would make that happen, given it is most likely we're going to procure some sort of non-nuclear powered option. And so looking at these three options, which are represented in this little figure here, what is kind of the best one, I would argue, is the multitasking one. It's the more feasible and realistic option, given the constraints and challenges that we've talked about, both in the short and long term that the organization faces, specifically dealing with the force's small size, uncertainty of what the regional hierarchy of priorities will and should be, and also other kind of uncertainties about whether Canada would actually kind of develop a more robust defense policy and programming, which would require massive changes to our kind of strategic culture, which I think would require big, almost existential challenges to the country. So multitasking, again, favors blue water over the Arctic, but understands that the RCN must become more Arctic capable over time and not just punt that responsibility to the AOPVs or any other follow-on Arctic specific platforms. And here, I think the motto isn't that the RCN needs to be Arctic first, but Arctic necessary. And I think that's a good way of kind of thinking about this moving forward. Again, I've talked about the submarine decision. That's going to be a major inflection point, about giving details about how the organization and specifically the government thinks about or doesn't think about pursuing this dual requirement. And here, I think even if we go in a non-SSN capability, there are lots of different options that would require us having to work with a lot of partners, including growing partnerships with countries like Japan and Korea about modifying existing submarines, which seem to have the durability and the size, but we'd need additional probably hull changes and other changes to make it more kind of Arctic capable. And so just to conclude here, just thinking about what does the organization need to do in the kind of short term, the next kind of five years or so. One is I think it's critical that we maintain the floor of the fleet size, and therefore there needs to be a replacement for the MCDVs. I think this is very critical that we maintain a certain kind of critical mass, which I think again is about that 24 to 30 warship number. I think that the organization is and has to continue to look at things like modularization, automation, uncrewed systems to extend reach and additional capabilities for the platforms that we have, both to make them more useful given the small numbers and also for the increasing range of activities that we want them to do. But I think that there are risks to think that these kind of additions can replace key figures of the Canadian RCN culture and the way that we operate our ships, specifically in terms of crewing, which I don't mind talking about some of the difficulties that I think we would run into if we rely too much on these options. And then finally, working with Arctic allies, specifically, I would say Denmark and Norway, other smaller countries, smaller navies, have an Arctic focus, but also have other kind of global operational priorities as well, working together, try to figure out ways that we can meet these requirements, but realizing that Canada has a very specific challenge given the Arctic archipelago, which the other two countries do not have. And finally, I think the multitasking option is going to reinforce this idea of one Navy. And it's not very well known outside the organization, but basically the one Navy concept has been around for about the last 15 years. And it's motivated on this idea that the organization is simply too small to specialize into different areas, and therefore it needs to break down possible divisions that could create waste and misguided attention and focus. And examples here is the loss of the functional differentiation between the reserve force, which usually ran the MCDVs, and the regular force, which ran the other vessels. Now it's all considered one fleet, one Navy. And also before that, we had different operational commands, Maritime Pacific on the West Coast and Maritime Atlantic on the East Coast. And they were almost seen as like kind of operating different navies. And now that has changed with each coast having a different responsibility, the West Coast in charge of training and force development, and the East Coast responsible for force deployment. And so I think, again, using the One Navy concept, we shouldn't allow the blue water and Arctic capable requirements to kind of diverge the RCN and separate into smaller little chunks, because it needs to be kept together given its small size. And finally, that's kind of more of a mentality and a practice, and not simply about what type of ships that we have and are going to procure in the future. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone for listening, and looking forward to the discussion later on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Adam. And thank you for keeping relatively close to the time limit. You were only 2 minutes and 30 seconds over, so well done on keeping within that context. I now turn the chair over to Kate. Kate, you may begin.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Todd, and it's my pleasure to speak to you today about the Royal Canadian Navy's past, present, and future in the Arctic. I want to extend my thanks to everyone at NAADSN and to Dr. Lackenbauer for inviting me to be here today. I'd also like to thank Nicole Covey for coordinating these panels and Dr. Hubert for moderating this one. Given my academic interest in maritime and Arctic security and background as a naval warfare officer, I was asked to speak about the Royal Canadian Navy in the Arctic. So today, I'm presenting a broad overview of the Navy's activities north of the 60th parallel to review the capabilities and issues the RCN has had over the years, and provide context for my overarching argument that given the changing context in the Arctic and importance of the region, Canada needs to break from established boom and bust cycles of investment in RCN capabilities and activities in the Arctic to ensure that the Navy is well equipped to operate in the region for decades to come. So what about the context in the Arctic is changing, and why does this matter for Canada? Climate change in the Canadian Arctic has led to a dramatic reduction in sea ice coverage over the last 50 years. This reduction in sea ice is making and has made the Arctic more accessible for ships, as well as for economic opportunities like mining, fishing, and tourism. Emerging opportunities in the Arctic have garnered international interest, increasing geopolitical tension in the region, as well as the risk of unregulated vessel transits, illegal activities, and emergencies, such as search and rescue scenarios and oil spills. Along the sea ice, permafrost in Canada's Arctic is melting, damaging existing infrastructure, making it harder to build new infrastructure, and contributing to challenges the Government of Canada already has, servicing defence facilities and communities in the region. The Arctic is home to 75% of Canada's total coastline, and the Canadian Arctic archipelago is considered to be internal Canadian waters. Canada's sovereignty over the region's maritime environment and ability to control and protect it has long been an area of concern. Economic opportunities and potential international competition over them arguably makes protecting Canada's sovereignty in the region more important now than ever before. As Canada's main instrument of maritime force, the RCN has played three essential roles in Canada's Arctic since it began operating in the region in 1948. A military role deterring other actors by projecting sea command, a diplomatic role executing policy objectives, as well as a constabulary role protecting Canada's maritime frontiers. However, the RCN's 75-year history in the Arctic has followed a boom and bust pattern of investment and activity, booming in times of perceived political and military danger, followed by periods of disinvestment when security interests have shifted elsewhere. As Mark Twain purportedly said, history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme, and rhyme it has since the RCN began operating north of the 60th parallel. Dr. Lackenbauer and Dr. Lajeunesse identified three distinct surges of military investment and activity in the Canadian Arctic since the end of the Second World War. The first of the three surges occurred in the first decade of the Cold War, when the strategic value of the North was realized by the US, Canada, and Russia alike. Starting in 1948, the RCN sent various classes of ships into Arctic waters to familiarize themselves with the terrain, support maritime research initiatives, and conduct resupply missions. In 1954, HMCS Labrador was the first RCN ship to circumnavigate the Arctic. Early operations such as this allowed the RCN to develop skills, test equipment, and gather scientific data that would be essential in facing potential Soviet threats. They also allowed the RCN to identify areas for further investment, such as infrastructure, charting, and equipment. As far back as the RCN's first Arctic cruise in 1948, a lack of refueling capabilities was identified that continues to plague the RCN to this day. The end of the first surge began in the late 1950s. Manning reductions, growing anti-submarine requirements in the Atlantic and Pacific, and the outbreak of the Korean War made Arctic operations a luxury that Canada could no longer afford. In the early 1960s, advancements in intercontinental missile technology lessened the threat of Soviet bombers targeting North America via the Arctic, leading Canada to cease RCN operations in the region in 1965. By 1970, Canadian investments and activities in the Arctic surged for the second time, as Canada-US disputes about the legal status of the Northwest Passage and new Soviet naval weapons and submarines renewed Canada's recognition of its vulnerabilities in the North. From 1970 to 1989, RCN ships were sent to the Arctic 10 times as part of the Navy's annual Northern Series of deployments, also known as NORPLOYs, as well as 3 resupply and surveillance operations, which all focused on demonstrating military presence, aiding with resupply missions and scientific research, and adding to the Navy's experience with Arctic operations. These operations were often conducted alongside Coast Guard icebreakers and Allied ships, and ranged year to year from excursions of one vessel to squadrons of destroyers. Although historians and other experts have called NORPLOYs largely symbolic and politically motivated, they achieved operational objectives aiding legitimate security requirements. The NORPLOYs included collaboration between the Defense Research Establishment and the RCN, aiding in setting up surveillance programs, charting the archipelago, and testing new technologies. In the late 1980s, there were calls for Canada to purchase a fleet of nuclear submarines, as well as to create CAF training centers in NAADSN to counter Soviet threats. However, by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, eliminating the main threat the RCN was used to deter in the Arctic. This unipolar moment, where the US became the world's uncontested hegemon, led to deep budget cuts and serious deterioration in RCN capabilities. NORPLOYs, the procurement of submarines, and the building of NANOCIVIC were canceled. RCN sailors refer to the period following this as the bathtub years, when ships that were available were their lowest count since the end of the Second World War. Arctic security and the importance of naval capabilities in the Arctic re-entered the Canadian zeitgeist for a third time in the 2000s, as climate change and international interest in Arctic sea routes and resources stoked old fears about challenges to Canadian sovereignty in the North. The Navy began to re-engage in the Arctic in 2002 and 2004 through Operation Narwhal, where RCN ships visited northern communities and participated in exercises with Canadian Rangers, the Coast Guard, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. These operations were followed by exercise in Operation Hudson Sentinel, an Arctic Fishery Patrol in 2005, and Operation Lancaster in 2006, where the RCN began integrating other government departments into northern exercises in order to support their mandates. The RCN's operations were coupled with new strategies released by the Department of Defense, highlighting the need for the RCN to be a 3-ocean Navy. In 2007, the RCN deepened their commitment to northern operations and began a yearly Operation Nanook series of joint and combined exercises that continue to this day and focus on building a whole of government cooperation that's needed to respond effectively to Arctic safety and security threats. In addition to Operation Nanook, the procurement of 6 new Arctic and offshore patrol vessels was announced, as well as the construction of a deep water docking and refueling port in NANOCIVIC. Presently, the RCN continues to be active in the Arctic by conducting yearly Operation Nanook deployments, as well as participating in international exercises in accordance with goals set by Canada's 2017 defense strategy, Strong, Secure, Engaged. Through these deployments, the RCN is building relationships with Indigenous communities throughout the Arctic and interoperability with allies. During current operations, Canada continues to lack refueling capabilities and relies on using ports in Greenland to resupply their ships. The potential refueling port in NANOCIVIC is still under construction as rising costs, delays due to COVID-19, and climate change continue pushing completion dates to the right. As of now, construction of much needed additional ports is not being planned. Along with lacking ports, the RCN is facing a critical manning shortage and calls for culture reform. Without solving these acute issues, the Navy will struggle to function on all theaters, including the Arctic. In more positive news, the RCN has acquired 3 of the 6 promised Arctic and offshore patrol vessels, and in 2021 conducted its first circumnavigation of the Northwest Passage since 1954 aboard HMCS Harry DeWolf. However, the vessels are already being repurposed as replacements for the RCN's aging maritime coastal defense vessels, operating outside of the Arctic in areas such as the Caribbean, as mentioned by Adam. Since 2021, the Navy's Canadian Patrol Submarine project has also been underway, looking at replacement options for the current Victoria submarine class that's slated to be decommissioned in the 2030s. Experts and CAF leaders are calling for the replacements to be Arctic capable, allowing them to aid in surveillance and deterrence in the region. From the 1940s until the 2000s, the RCN's history comprised of a series of discontinuous investments and activities in the Arctic. Contrastingly, since the 2000s, the Government of Canada's focus on the Arctic hasn't waned and has instead intensified. Recognition of the geopolitical tension and opportunities in the region has prompted experts and Canadian leaders to call for a reassessment of Canada's investments in Arctic security, including the RCN. Countless newspaper and journal articles, as well as report after report by House of Commons committees and the Senate, have been published describing the inadequacy of the Navy's abilities in the North and how infrastructure as well as new platforms and equipment is needed to augment RCN capabilities. Going back to the Mark Twain quote about history not repeating but rhyming, Canada has seen 3 surges of military investments and activities in the Arctic. Unlike previous surges, the one that began in the 2000s has not declined, seemingly because perceived threats have grown rather than shrunk. The physical and geopolitical climate in the Arctic continues to change and will continue to for decades to come. Although there's no present threat to Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic, Canada's Chief of Defence Staff, General Wayne Eyre, has cautioned that this may not always be the case. So what does this mean for Canada's future in the Arctic? Although the RCN's rate of Arctic deployments and exercises is likely to remain the same, as they are the mainstay of both Strong, Secure, Engaged and Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, cooperation with Arctic partners is of growing importance. Since Canada's United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act received royal assent and reaffirmed the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine and develop their own community priorities in 2021, government planners and the military will have to come to terms with the fact that they cannot unilaterally impose their will on Indigenous residents in the North. Cooperation and consultation will be essential for both planning military activities and infrastructure developments to support military goals. Cooperation and conducting joint exercises with allied Arctic states is increasingly important, as belligerent state actors, including Russia and China, demonstrate interest in the Arctic and a lack of respect for the rules-based international order. Since Finland and Sweden joined NATO in 2023, 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are now NATO allies. Future NATO exercises in the North would allow allies to develop interoperability and demonstrate resolve against Russian and Chinese cooperation in the Arctic. In the coming decades, the RCN's capabilities are likely to be bolstered. The Navy expects to acquire the 3 outstanding Arctic and offshore patrol vessels by 2027. Potential procurements of Arctic-capable submarines would also provide Canada with unparalleled sea command and intelligence gathering capabilities. Vice Admiral Angus Topshee has advocated strongly for Canada to purchase 12 submarines, so 4 can be dedicated to patrolling and defending the Arctic. However, with culture change in the CAF remaining unresolved, manning at already critical levels, and no rebound in sight for Canada's declining workforce, finding operators for the new platforms will be difficult. Uncrewed underwater vehicles have been identified as an alternative to purchasing submarines, but this technology is still in a nascent form. In future decades, the RCN may look to acquire alternatives like these, which cost significantly less than submarines and require fewer operators. In terms of infrastructure, the RCN will soon be able to utilize the Nanisivik port that's predicted to be operational by 2025, and the construction of new multi-purpose port facilities is gaining support. Although Nanisivik will be open for Navy use in the immediate future, an Auditor General report from 2022 estimates that the RCN will only be able to use the port for 4 weeks per year. The Arctic and Northern Policy Framework and a report published by the Senate in 2023 have pushed for multi-purpose port facilities to be established in the Arctic in consultation with Indigenous communities that would benefit both the RCN and Indigenous partners. Although there are currently no plans for such construction, growing vessel traffic and accessibility in the region will necessitate more and better infrastructure be built. The RCN's future in the Arctic is also largely hinged upon the Government of Canada's priorities that will be reestablished in the upcoming Defence Policy Update, slated to be released this year. To reflect global changes since 2017, the Department of Defense is releasing a new version of its defense policy. As an update to, rather than a total rehaul of Strong, Secure, Engaged, it can be expected to include the previous strategy's focus on increased presence and working alongside partners in the Arctic, but may prove to be more forward-thinking in its assessment of the RCN's infrastructure and platform-related needs. As changes continue to affect the Arctic, the Navy's ability to protect Canada's northern border needs to change with it. It's up to the Government of Canada to ensure that it acknowledges the growing importance of the Arctic and plans for a future where the Royal Canadian Navy can sustainably protect Canada's interests in the North, rather than following established boom and bust patterns. Thank you.